Okay, let's dive right in. As hosts of a show that, well, often explores the potential for connection between different realms,
Hmm.
these big questions. What it means to be alive, what happens when we die,
Hmm.
and, what might lie beyond what we can physically perceive.
Hmm.
These are just so central to everything we talk about.
They really are the core questions.
And today, we're doing a deep dive into, honestly, a truly fascinating historical perspective on those exact questions. And it's presented with this surprising rigor and confidence.
That's right. We're stepping back a bit, specifically to the late 1800s. It was such a period of huge change, right?
Right.
Scientific discoveries, but
Mhm.
also a lot of spiritual questioning.
Definitely.
And the text we're looking at, it comes right out of that era. It lays out this really robust, detailed argument for spiritual realities, a text that quite boldly promises unanswerable logic on these, profound matters: life, death, the unseen world.
Unanswerable logic. I mean, that's quite the claim, isn't it?
It really is.
So our source material for this deep dive, it comes from excerpts of a text published under that exact title. We're specifically looking at what the source calls the following thoughts that reach the Earth sphere.
Uh-huh. Transplanted, as it were, from the land of the immortal to the home of the mortal. Quite poetic.
It is. And the individual whose consciousness, after passing into spirit life, is said to be the source of these thoughts is Thomas Gales Forster, born 1816, and, as the text puts it, born into spirit life in 1886.
Right. And the source gives us a little background on him, too, son of a Unitarian minister.
Yeah, and interestingly, it says he first looked into Unitarianism, intending to, challenge it,
Oh, really?
but then through that investigation, actually ended up embracing it, which
Yeah.
I think kind of gives you a hint about his intellectual world, right?
Hmm.
Willing to really dig into things, maybe challenge the status quo of his time.
That's a great point. And the source, it doesn't really shy away from the personal cost he apparently faced for his beliefs and, being associated with these ideas.
No, it mentions ostracism and neglect of relatives and former friends. Calls it painful beyond expression for someone with his acknowledged sensitive nature.
But then it immediately reframes that suffering, doesn't it? Puts a spiritual lens on it. Suggests that now, in what it calls the glory land of righteous compensation, he probably looks back and,
Yeah, it says he likely blesses every experience he has ever passed through and would not have missed one of them, however painful at the time.
right. It clearly sees his dedication, his advocacy for these spiritual concepts as being of immense worth. Like any earthly hardship was just a small price to pay for this bigger truth.
So for our deep dive today, our mission is really to unpack this specific viewpoint.
Yeah.
The perspective on spiritualism presented in this historical text. What are its core claims about life, about death, the universe beyond our senses?
Uh-huh. And how does it systematically challenge the conventional thinking of its day, especially traditional theology, its take on scripture, on dogma?
Exactly. And maybe most interesting for us today, how do these arguments coming from the late 19th century, how do they resonate? Or maybe how do they fundamentally challenge our modern perspectives on these huge questions?
Yeah.
It's a historical snapshot for sure. Gives us a window into the spiritualist movement's intellectual side. But it's also a look at this really comprehensive worldview that was earnestly trying to prove spiritual realities through phenomena, through logic.
Which ties in directly with the kinds of explorations we do here.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It feels very relevant to our ongoing conversation.
So my role throughout this discussion will be to provide some context on that era, the late 1800s, rapid science, rising secularism, but also this widespread fascination with spiritual stuff, spiritualism becoming a really significant movement.
Right.
And we'll look at how the text's arguments try to weave together spiritual phenomena with the science and philosophy of that moment, using logic, history, analogy, building its case piece by piece.
And I'll be guiding us through, setting the stage, making connections, and honestly, just sharing my excitement for digging into this unique and often, frankly, surprising historical lens on questions that, well, they've captivated people forever, haven't they?
Since the beginning.
And questions we dedicate so much time to exploring right here. So think of this, you listening, as a journey. Not just through some old document, but through a really different framework for understanding maybe the biggest questions you've ever thought about.
Yeah.
Existence, reality, yourself.
Okay, let's start then. Let's start with maybe the most fundamental concept the source presents, the nature of man. It asserts right off the bat, really clearly, that the spirit is the real man.
That's such a simple statement, but wow, it's powerful, isn't it?
It
It
is.
just flips the script on views that see the body as the main thing, maybe with a spirit tacked on. This text says, nope, the spirit isn't something you have, it's what you are.
Exactly. It's the intelligent principle, the enduring core identity.
The real you.
Precisely. And building right on that, the source introduces the concept of the spiritual body.
Okay. And what's that like?
Well, it's not described as, abstract or formless. It's presented as a tangible reality, just made of a more refined ethereal substance than, physical matter.
Ethereal but tangible. Interesting.
Yeah, it calls it the inner casket of the intelligent soul. And it's definitely distinct, separate from the physical body.
So the physical body then, in this view,
Yeah.
it gets kind of demoted, right?
Significantly. It's called a temporary mold or a clay statue, even a muddy vesture of decay.
Ouch. Muddy vesture.
Yeah. Its function is limited. It's just designed for earthly life, for this specific environment, not for the eternal existence of the self.
Right.
And the text is pretty critical of views that reduce people to just, matter. It specifically argues against the idea that the brain of man is the mind of man.
The brain is instrument idea.
Exactly. The brain is the tool, not the source of consciousness. And similarly, it pushes back against the idea of a purely material resurrection. It sees that as totally misunderstanding the true nature, the destiny of the real man, the spirit.
Because focusing on the physical body that decays just misses the point of what identity and consciousness actually are, according to this source.
Precisely. It misses the essential element.
It really is a total inversion of how many of us are maybe culturally conditioned to think.
Yeah.
Instead of being a body that has a spirit,
Uh-huh.
this says you are an immortal spirit, just temporarily using a physical body for your earthly experience. It's quite a radical reframing when you think about it.
It is. And the source really tries to elaborate on this crucial difference, spirit versus physical body, often using analogies.
Like what?
Well, it talks about physical matter, organs like the brain, nerves. They're just instruments, the intelligent principle the spirit uses. The brain might be a superior instrument, sure, but it's not the origin of thought. It uses an analogy like a weaver using a loom. The loom, the physical body, is needed for the earthly creation, the experience, but it's separate from the weaver, the spirit.
Yasha.
And it mentions Ulysses returning home, finds his old stuff, the material surroundings, physically there, but they don't serve the same vital purpose now that he, the consciousness, is back and maybe has moved on. Similarly, when the spirit leaves the body...
The body's still there for a bit, but the lights are off, essentially. The animating principle is gone.
Exactly. The real man has departed, which really contrasts with any of you saying the physical organs themselves generate consciousness.
Okay, so if the spirit is the real man, the enduring self, what happens when this temporary mold, the physical body, stops working? That takes us straight to death, doesn't it?
It does. And according to this text, death is absolutely not an end, not annihilation.
So what is it?
It's described as an exodus, a withdrawal of the man himself, the intelligent principle, from the physical body. It's framed as a natural transition, a transfer from the physical sphere to another, more refined one. Yeah. The source uses the phrase, born into spirit life, to describe it, which sounds much more like a natural progression, doesn't it? Rather than some terrifying final event.
Born into spirit life.
Yeah.
Yeah, that definitely lands differently than, the way death is often portrayed in some traditional views. Less dark, less fearful.
Absolutely. And critically, the source really stresses that in this transition, the spirit form stays intact, recognizable.
You mean like you'd still look like you?
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
It retains the features, the sentiments, the emotions of the individual. The text says, quite beautifully, I think, the same eye sparkles, the same ear is quick to recognize, the same voice vibrates, the same face is radiant with affection.
Wow.
The same memory brings up the images of the past. The same individual consciousness identifies the man. It's not some vague, formless essence. It's the individual you knew. Their consciousness, memories, affections, all preserved.
That stands in such stark contrast to the horror and fear of death that the source says comes from traditional theology.
Right. It claims that fear stems from basic misunderstandings about our true spiritual nature and our ultimate destiny. By focusing only on the body's decay and painting this picture of a fearful, judgmental afterlife, traditional views, according to this text, just create unnecessary dread.
And they even find support for this idea of death as a withdrawal, an exodus, within the Bible itself.
They do. It points to Peter talking about his own upcoming death in 2 Peter. The original Greek word translated as decease is apparently exodus.
Huh. Exodus, like leaving.
Exactly. The source argues Peter's language implies a departure from his body into a state where he could still remember things, still make an effort. Endeavor that ye may be able after my decease exodus to have these things always in remembrance.
So Peter expected to still be Peter, essentially, after his physical death, able to remember and act.
That's the argument, that it supports the idea that the real man, the conscious spirit, just exits the physical form and continues with memory and agency.
You know, for anyone listening who's grappled with that fear of dying or the grief of losing someone, this perspective, as the source presents it, it really does offer a potentially powerful comfort, doesn't it?
It really does.
It basically says the person you loved, their mind, their personality, their love for you isn't gone. They've just transitioned. And importantly, they're still close by.
And that idea of nearness is absolutely crucial. It leads us right into how the source describes the spiritual world itself. It's not some far-off place, somewhere outside of and beyond the solar and astral systems, as it critiques some traditional views for suggesting.
Well, so where is it?
Right here.
Ah.
Intimately connected to our material reality. The source says it surrounds and interpenetrates the material universe.
Interpenetrates, like occupies the same space.
Kind of. It's described as being as closely united thereto as is the soul to the body, suggesting this inseparable, interwoven relationship. Two dimensions occupying the same cosmic space, perhaps. It's definitely described as a more ethereal realm made of spiritual substance essentially distinct from what is known as matter, which is why we can't normally perceive it with our physical senses, right?
It has to be different somehow.
But, and this is key, it's also presented as substantial and tangible, just not to our senses. It's substantial and tangible to spiritualist senses, just like our physical world feels real to our physical senses. It's not just like empty space or pure thought.
And it's definitely not empty of life, according to the source.
Not at all. It says it's teeming with angelic life, but then it immediately clarifies what it means by that.
Which is important. What does it mean?
It primarily means the immortal souls of men and women who once lived on Earth or other worlds. So angels in this context aren't usually a separate race of beings. They're mostly the progressed spirits of people who have lived and died.
So our ancestors' loved ones, they become the angelic life.
Largely, yes. Or potentially beings from other planets who've also transitioned. It's a much more populated and familiar concept of the spiritual realm.
And it suggests there's even a structure to it, like levels or something.
Yeah, it talks about concentric ethereal realms or spheres circling planets and solar systems, filled with souls who are progressing. Each sphere may be representing a different stage of spiritual development.
Wow, so it's this vast, dynamic, populated cosmos stretching way beyond what we can see with telescopes.
That's the picture it paints.
A vibrant, unseen world existing right alongside ours, right here, right now. Just beyond our physical perception, but maybe accessible in other ways.
And the source really works to make this idea of a near, interpenetrating spiritual world seem plausible, often using analogies from the science of its time.
Like electricity and magnetism, things they were just starting to understand then.
Exactly. It points to those unseen forces. They're imperceptible substance, right? Intangible to us, but their effects are undeniable and they follow natural laws. So the source argues, just like there are physical phenomena on different wavelengths, think X-rays, radio waves, things invisible or inaudible to us, the spiritual world exists on a kind of higher octave, a different frequency range.
And we access that.
How?
Through spiritual senses. Clairvoyance, clear seeing, clear audience, clear hearing. These senses, it suggests, can perceive those higher vibrations that our physical organs miss.
That's actually a really clever way to use the science of the time, isn't it? Using energy, vibrations, unseen forces to make the spiritual claims feel like they operate under natural law, not break it.
Precisely. It suggests these abilities aren't supernatural, they're just extensions of natural capabilities operating on a different level. It's arguing that what spiritualism demonstrates, like through mediumship, isn't supernatural, as in breaking God's laws,
Right.
but operates under higher natural law, maybe ones we don't fully grasp yet. It even uses analogies from sound, like sympathetic vibration, how things resonate.
Or like overtones, the clang tint it mentions.
Yeah.
Different frequencies coexisting. Exactly. You just need the right receiver, the right sensitivity to pick them up. It mentions the microphone, which was pretty new then as an example. Technology increasing sensitivity to subtle vibrations already there.
So spiritual senses are like that microphone, picking up the subtle vibrations of the spirit world.
That's the analogy, yeah. trying to ground it all in natural principles. It seems to be a running theme frames spiritual reality within natural laws and scientific ideas as they understood them back then.
Right. It wants to present spiritualism not as just blind faith, but as this logical system you can investigate and understand, something that aligns with the natural world.
Absolutely. Maybe operating under principles like the law of affinity, like attracts, like drawing similar energies or spirits together.
Okay, so we've got the spirit is the real self, death is a transition, a nearby spiritual world. What's life like in that spiritual world, according to the source? What's the journey?
Well, the absolute fundamental principle is the perpetuity of individual consciousness, individual memory, and individual affection beyond the grave.
Meaning, you're still you. You don't lose who you are, your memories, your feelings for people.
Exactly. The you that was here is the you that continues there. Your identity remains intact.
And what's the main rule, the guiding principle for existence there?
The text identifies it very clearly. Universal progress. And this progress is proportioned to individual effort and desire.
So it's not like you arrive at heaven or hell and that's it, fixed forever.
Not at all, according to this source. That's a major contrast it draws with traditional ideas. It's a continuous process, growth, development, and you have a hand in how fast you progress based on your actions, your desires.
Your effort. Okay. But what about, consequences? Like if you weren't a great person on Earth, does it address retribution?
It does. It acknowledges concepts like retribution or compensation for earthly actions. Unhappy conditions after death are seen as the direct result of the character you built, the things you did here. We reap as we have sown, as it says.
Okay, so there are consequences.
Yes, but, and this is a huge but, in this framework, these unhappy conditions are described as probationary and purifying and therefore terminable.
Terminable, meaning not eternal.
Exactly. They're not eternal punishment. They're temporary states for learning, for purification, designed to eventually lead you back to the path of progress.
So suffering isn't forever, but joy and growth can be.
Precisely. Conversely, the source says joy and harmony in the spirit life are elevating and improving and therefore forever advancing. There's no cap on growth, no limit to happiness.
Wow.
It quotes that poem, which really sums it up. We shape ourselves, our joy or fear, of which the coming life is made, and fill our future's atmosphere with sunshine or with shade.
That puts so much responsibility on the individual, doesn't it? But also makes it so hopeful. You shape your future state and growth never ends. Feels empowering.
It really does, especially compared to doctrines of eternal damnation, which the source strongly rejects. And this idea of endless progress, it doesn't just apply to individual souls after death. No, the source sees it as a universal law for all of existence. From the simplest matter, the aboriginal granite it mentions, evolving upwards through nature, culminating in humankind.
And then humans keep evolving spiritually.
Right, towards archangel and celestial glory. Matter and mind, it argues, are both subject to this one huge, overarching law of universal progress and evolution.
Okay, so that's the core framework. Spirit is real, death is transition, the spiritual world is near and progressing. Now, how does this stack up against, really, how does it challenge the traditional theology of its time? Because the source spends a lot of time on that.
Oh, it draws very sharp contrasts, deliberately. A key difference is the view of God. The source presents the divine as infinite and indivisible, an infinite geometer ruling with unerring precision and such unbounded beneficence.
So a God of natural law, order, love, not anger.
Exactly, which it sets directly against what it calls the avenging God of the theologians. A picture associated with fear, harsh judgment, maybe arbitrary rules leading to things like eternal hell.
A completely different vibe.
Totally. And maybe the biggest theological target is the doctrine of the Trinity.
Right, you mentioned that earlier. It's pretty harsh on the Trinity.
Unsparing, calls it wholly at variance with truth, unmistakably a forgery. And it goes into surprising detail, showing a real grasp of theological history and textual criticism.
Like what kind of detail?
Well, it argues against the specific Trinitarian formula, the verse in 1 John 5.7 through 8, saying it's absent from early Greek and Latin manuscripts.
Okay.
It points out that early church fathers, even when arguing about the Trinity, didn't quote that specific verse, suggesting it wasn't seen as authentic back then.
Interesting.
And it highlights the long, often messy history of the Trinity debates and the church councils, where the doctrine was gradually formalized over centuries. Arguing this shows it was a later development, not the original truth.
That's pretty deep into the weeds of historical theology for a spiritualist text from the 1800s. Suggests the author, or the source of the thoughts, was really familiar with these debates.
They clearly were. They're not just making vague claims, they're engaging with specific scholarly points, manuscript evidence, council history, using Christian history itself to argue against established dogma.
And this critical approach extends to how it reads the Bible, too, right?
Yeah.
Mistranslations, misinterpretation.
Yes, absolutely crucial to its argument, because so many doctrines it dislikes are based on specific Bible verses. The source argues that many fear-inducing ideas come from just misunderstanding or poorly translating the original texts.
Like the concept of hell.
Exactly. It meticulously argues that the Hebrew word Sheol and the Greek word Hades, often translated as hell, really just meant the unseen realm, the general state or place of the dead, not necessarily a place of fiery torment.
Okay, but what about Gehenna? That's the one usually linked to hellfire.
It tackles Gehenna specifically, explains it comes from Gehinnom, the Valley of Hinnom, a real valley outside Jerusalem. Historically, it was a place where trash was burned, maybe associated with bad stuff in the past.
Right.
So the source argues that in the New Testament, Gehenna was used symbolically, representing utter destruction, annihilation, maybe a miserable death, but not conscious eternal suffering. It even cites Universalists and some Second Adventists of the time who also argued against eternal torment based on these terms.
So the whole terrifying idea of eternal hell, according to the source, is largely built on mistranslating words for the grave, or a literal valley, and then taking symbolic language way too literally.
That's the core of its linguistic argument, yes. It undermines the fear by re-examining the words themselves, arguing it clashes with a loving God and universal progress.
It also challenges the idea of miracles as violations of natural law.
It does. It argues the Greek word semeion, often translated miracle, really just means sign.
A sign, not a miracle.
Right. And it points out quite cleverly that in the King James Bible, the word miracle is often italicized or just not there in the original Greek in places in Matthew, Mark, Luke. The original word is semeion.
Suggesting the translators added the interpretation of miracle as something supernatural.
That's the implication. By framing them as signs, the source suggests these biblical events weren't necessarily breaks from natural law, but maybe extraordinary events happening under higher, less understood natural laws, laws accessible through spiritual means, perhaps.
Which fits perfectly with its view of spiritualism operating under higher natural laws, too.
Exactly. It's all part of the same system. Trying to explain seemingly extraordinary biblical events within a broader understanding of nature, not as exceptions to it. And its critique of biblical infallibility is really strong for its time. It directly questions the idea that the Bible we have is word for word from God.
How does it back that up?
Points to the long, complex history of translations. Lists ancient versions, Armenian, Syrian, Ethiopian, showing the text passed through many languages, many hands. Mentions famous old manuscripts like the Vatican and Alexandrine codices, noting even they have variations, missing bits.
Okay.
And it highlights actual translation errors. The famous one it uses is Moses' face after seeing God. The Hebrew meant radiated light, but got translated as horned.
Which led to Michelangelo's statue of Moses with horns.
Precisely. It uses that well-known image as concrete proof that human error demonstrably affected the text, undermining any claim of perfect verbatim infallibility.
That's a powerful example.
It also digs into how the King James Version itself was made. Mentions King James I telling translators to keep old ecclesiastical words. The source argues this prioritized church tradition over accurate translation, living in phrases that maybe didn't align with a loving God or modern scholarship.
So preserving tradition over accuracy.
That's the charge. And it notes how resistant people were even later to fixing known errors, like when the American Bible Society tried revisions in the mid-1800s. Suggests a kind of dogmatic refusal to admit the text wasn't perfect.
Wow. Again, that's a really detailed critique of the Bible's history and text. It seems clear the source is using all this to weaken the authority of interpretations based on these texts.
Exactly.
And open the door for spiritualism's claims, based on phenomena and its own logic, as a potentially more reliable source of truth.
That's precisely the strategy. Question the foundation of traditional dogma, God's nature, hell, miracles, the Bible's perfection, to create space for spiritualism's answers as more logical, more benevolent, more consistent with nature and spirit.
And beyond just biblical interpretation, it tackles some really fundamental doctrines too, right? Like the fall of man.
Yes, it rejects foundational ideas like the fall from a perfect state, the special creation of Adam and Eve as the first humans about 6,000 years ago, and the idea that humans are inherently sinful because of total depravity.
Why reject those?
It argues they lead to fear, guilt, and just a really low view of human nature, portraying us as inherently flawed and fallen.
So what's the alternative explanation for where humans came from?
Evolution. It argues humans are a product of evolution under divine impulsion, not fallen from perfection, but risen from lower states. The result of continuous elaboration of the higher from the lower conditions?
Guided evolution. And it uses science to back this up.
Absolutely. It pulls evidence from various scientific fields of the day. Archaeology finding ancient human remains showing deep history. Comparative craniology studying skulls showing links between humans and other forms.
Okay.
Flora and fauna distribution across the globe suggesting evolutionary spread, not single creation points. Geology, the nebular theory for planet formation, implying natural development, plus fossils and rock layers showing life progressing over huge timescales.
Wow, it's really building a case.
And medical science, too, cites how the human fetus develops, supposedly echoing lower animal brain stages, and the discovery of protoplasm as the common physical basis of all life, linking plants, animals, humans, all used to support human development from lower forms over vast time, guided by divine law, not a special recent creation.
So it's weaving its spiritual philosophy together with the science of the 1800s, creating this unified view where spirit is part of this natural, evolving, divinely guided universe.
Exactly. It's this comprehensive system trying to offer alternative explanations seemingly more rational, more benevolent for the big questions, grounding them in both spiritual insight and scientific observation of the time.
Which means doctrines like vicarious atonement, Jesus dying to appease an angry God for our sins, wouldn't really make sense in this framework, would they?
The source basically dismisses them because the premises are gone. If you reject the idea of a vengeful God needing appeasement, and reject eternal hell in the traditional sense.
There's nothing to be saved from in that way.
Right. Retribution exists, sure, but it's temporary purifying within a system of endless progress. So the need for a savior to take eternal punishment for you just becomes obsolete in their view.
It also challenges the idea that Christian traditions are uniquely divine by pointing to older origins.
Yes, it argues many Christian practices, symbols, even dates have roots in older, often pagan customs that got absorbed. Christmas on December 25th, close to winter solstice festivals. Easter and Sunday observance, possibly linked to sun worship or spring festivals. Carnival, Lent, even the symbolic number 40.
It claims these have parallels or origins in older traditions.
Exactly. And it uses this to question claims of unique divine authority for these specific traditions, arguing they're part of a broader human cultural evolution, not exclusive divine mandates separate from everything else. Challenges the basis for sectarianism built around them.
It sounds like the source is pretty critical of organized religion in general, not just specific doctrines, calling out sectarian teachings and ecclesiastical arrogance.
Very much so. It laments how pure truths got covered up beneath an incrustation of traditional paganism, ecclesiastical arrogance, and popular ignorance. It sees institutions sometimes prioritizing dogma and control over real spiritual understanding or kindness.
And it even includes that sharp little anecdote.
Yeah, the quote about a clergyman preaching piety, but also loans at 25%, using that to suggest hypocrisy, questioning the moral authority behind some of the doctrines being pushed.
This whole section really positions spiritualism, as presented here, not just as an alternative belief system, but as this direct, reasoned challenge to deeply rooted religious ideas and institutions. It's really pushing the reader, or you, the listener, to question origins, interpretations, the basis for what you've been taught, using history, language, science.
It absolutely is. The critique isn't subtle, but it consistently frames its own arguments as based on unanswerable logic, historical facts, linguistic accuracy, and the laws of nature and spirit, positioning itself as more rational, more truthful than what it sees as flawed, fear-based systems.
Okay, speaking of those laws of nature and spirit, let's talk about mediumship. It's such a cornerstone of historical spiritualism and something we explore a lot on this show. How does the source present it?
It defines mediumship simply as the means, the channel, for communication between the spirit world and the material world. And crucially, totally consistent with its worldview, it insists this communication operates according to natural law.
Not a miracle, not breaking rules.
Definitely not. It's framed as just a functional part of how the universe works. Like any other natural process, just maybe operating on those higher octave vibrations we talked about.
So like a natural bridge.
Mm-hmm.
an energetic connection between these two interpenetrating realms.
And that's a good way to put it. Accessing that nearby spirit world through people who have a certain sensitivity or are developed to act as instruments for communication from the other side.
And the source boldly compares modern mediumship to stuff in the Bible.
Yes, extensively. Arguing it's illogical to accept the ancient stories but deny modern ones that seem similar.
What kind of biblical examples does it use?
Things like angels appearing and talking to people, prophets hearing voices, having visions like Ezekiel hearing a voice from the sky, healings attributed to spiritual power, the transfiguration where Moses and Elias appeared with a Jesus,
Right.
even Saul using the witch of Endor to talk to Samuel, or Daniel being protected in the lion's den or fiery furnace by an angel. It sees all these as examples of spirit communication, appearance, or intervention, analogous to modern mediumship.
So the argument is, if you believe those happened through divine or angelic means back then, why dismiss similar things today just because they happen through people called mediums?
Precisely. It frames it as inconsistent, believing the dream of other ages in Scripture, but denying the fact of today in spiritualism. It tackles the charge of necromancy, forbidden communication with the dead head-on, by pointing out that biblical figures, including Jesus talking with Moses and Elias, did communicate with the departed. So the principle itself can't be inherently evil or forbidden, the source implies. Maybe the nature or source matters, but communication itself isn't automatically wrong.
That makes perfect sense within their framework. If the spirit world is right here, full of conscious people, communication through natural means should be possible, not forbidden.
And again, it stresses it's not supernatural, as in breaking law, but happens under higher natural laws. Maybe principles like that law of affinity, like helping connect spirits in the material world via a receptive medium.
What does it say about the mediums themselves, the people acting as these channels? What's their role? What challenges do they face?
He describes them as instruments, channels, emphasizes they're the means for communication, and a really crucial point makes is that phenomena depend heavily on mediumistic requirements and conditions.
Meaning it's not guaranteed. It depends on certain factors.
Exactly. Results aren't absolute. They depend on specific conditions being met, which follow the natural laws of the spirit world.
Like the medium's state, the environment, who's present.
Yes, it explicitly mentions results can be affected by inharmonious conditions, maybe from sitters bringing doubt or negativity, or just the general vibe of the place. It also says the medium's own physical mental state, their overall condition, really influences the outcome.
Practical things, too.
Yeah, it even touches on mediums needing to earn a living, which might force them into other work, possibly impacting their ability to stay sensitive or maintain the right conditions for mediumship.
That adds a real human element, doesn't it? It acknowledges it's not just flipping a switch. It's complex, subject to human factors, energy, conditions.
And the source doesn't dodge the issue of fraud either, which was obviously a huge criticism of spiritualism.
Right.
It admits, frankly, that fraud happens, caused by the medium's imperfections, maybe sometimes driven by desperation, poverty, lack of support, leading them to fake things. But while acknowledging that human weakness, it strongly condemns fraudulent individuals, urges people to avoid them as we would the deadly viper.
Wow. Strong words.
Yeah.
But it argues fraud doesn't disprove the real thing.
Exactly. It makes a strong case against throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Says fraudulent mediums don't invalidate genuine mediumship any more than corrupt people or hypocrisy invalidate other systems, religious or otherwise.
It's an imperfection, not proof the whole thing is false.
That's the argument. The focus should be on seeking genuine phenomena under good conditions, not dismissing everything because of challenges or fakes.
So it's presenting a pretty realistic view, perhaps, acknowledging the potential, but also the human flaws and the need for the right conditions.
I think so. Trying to integrate the phenomena into its logical, naturalistic framework, while admitting the difficulties in bridging worlds and the human element involved.
We've mentioned it a few times, but it's striking how much the source leans on the science of its day, using analogies, trying to find support. Can we revisit some of those key scientific connections again?
Absolutely. It's a major feature of the text. Using concepts from the late 19th century to explain or bolster its spiritual claims.
Like the whole vibration thing for clairvoyance and clairaudience?
Yes, that's a prime example. It goes into the science of light and color as specific vibration frequencies, red light vibrating X times per second, violet Y times.
Okay.
And it uses that established science to propose, by analogy, these higher octave vibrations beyond our physical senses, vibrations that are the spiritual world. Clairvoyance and clairaudience are then the spiritual senses picking up those frequencies.
Perceiving the normally imperceptible. And the microphone analogy fits there too.
It does. The microphone was newish then. A scientific marvel showing how technology could boost sensitivity to faint sounds already present. The source uses it to suggest mediums develop a similar increased sensitivity, but on a spiritual level, letting them tune in to the subtle vibrations of the spirit world.
So spiritual senses are like natural receivers, just tuned to a different, higher frequency band.
That seems to be the idea, trying to explain these abilities using the cutting-edge science of energy, waves, communication available then, showing they could fit within a broader natural law.
What about that etheria concept linked to the spiritual body? That sounded a bit more speculative.
It was based on a specific contemporary scientific theory about animal heat coming from nutrition. This theory proposed a subtle substance, etheria, derived from food, released energy, heat, when transformed in the body.
Right.
The source then connects this, maybe tentatively, to its idea of the spiritual body being made of ethereal substance. It speculates perhaps these ethereal particles from food or breath combine with others in the body to form the spiritual body, and maybe its transformation releases vital energy. It's a bit speculative, as the source admits.
Using a specific, maybe now outdated theory of the time.
Right. But it served the purpose of suggesting a plausible physical or ethereal physical basis for the spiritual body, rooted in contemporary ideas about energy and substance.
And the constant references back to protoplasm and evolution.
Huge reliance on that. Protoplasm as the common physical basis of all life reinforced the unity of life, supporting evolution. That discovery, plus evidence from archaeology, ancient humans, craniology, skull links, embryology, fetal development stages, geology, fossil layers, all marshaled to argue against special creation.
And for gradual development from lower forms.
Exactly. Man evolving over immense time, guided by divine law, with the spiritual self as the culmination. It creates this integrated view, physical evolution over ages, and the spiritual self developing within and then beyond that physical framework.
So spiritual reality isn't separate, but the higher dimension of this single design evolutionary process.
That's the picture. And finally, it uses the understanding of the brain and nervous system back then to argue the brain is just an instrument, not the source of consciousness.
The Ulysses analogy again, the house, not the resident.
Right. It details brain parts, medulla, cerebellum, cerebrum, and their functions. Then argues that cases of severe head injury where faculties remain or recover suggest the intelligent principle, the conscious self, is using the brain, not being the brain.
Which supports the idea consciousness resides in the spiritual body, just interfacing with the brain during life.
Exactly. Counters materialism and also theological views tied only to the physical body or resurrection.
It's just fascinating how this old text weaves together its spiritual claims with the science it had available. Even if some of that science is outdated now, the method is striking, trying to find correlations, use analogies, ground spiritual ideas in natural law. That seems key to its claim of logic.
It absolutely reflects the ambition of spiritualism, then, to be seen not just as weird phenomena, but as a rational, consistent truth system that could engage with modern thought and science, proving spiritual realities were part of a larger natural order, not exceptions to it.
Step back a bit. The source presents spiritualism as much more than just talking to spirits, right?
Right.
It frames it as revealing these fundamental, universal truths.
Yes, very strongly. It argues the core truths demonstrated by spiritualism: fatherhood of God, brotherhood of man, immortality, ministry of angels, meaning help from departed spirits, aren't unique to Christianity or any one religion.
And it finds evidence for this everywhere.
It claims so. Cites ancient philosophers Pythagoras, Socrates, Seneca, saying their teachings had elements of these truths. References other traditions, Zoroaster, Confucius, ancient Egyptian, Hindu, Chaldean beliefs, suggesting they also held aspects of these universal principles, even points to pagan customs.
It quotes Confucius and Seneca directly.
Yeah, quoting Confucius on the Golden Rule, what you do not want done to yourself, do not do to others. And Seneca on God being near, within us, observing good and evil, using these as examples of deep spiritual insights found across cultures, outside the Christian context.
So this positions spiritualism not as some new sect, but as a modern demonstration of truths that have always been around, maybe just obscured by dogma later.
Exactly. It's a direct counter to the exclusivity and sectarianism it criticizes elsewhere, suggesting spiritualism reveals the underlying reality that various religions glimpsed, but maybe got distorted by human institutions.
It also seems to advocate for a different kind of devotion. Less about ritual, more about genuine feeling and action.
Definitely. Prayer, it suggests, isn't about fixed formulas or begging a distant God. It's heartfelt connection. The divine principle hears the heart. True prayer is sincere aspiration, soul communion.
And its take on Thanksgiving was really interesting, criticizing the usual religious or national ties.
Right. It says real Thanksgiving isn't about victory over enemies or specific dogma. It's gratitude for nature's gifts and, crucially, found in loving service to humanity.
And then it makes that really powerful, inclusive statement.
Yeah, that anyone doing loving service, Catholic or Protestant, saint or sinner, atheist or deist, infidel or spiritualist, whatever their belief or lack of it, sounds a loftier note of praise and gratitude than any pulpit speech or cathedral hymn.
Wow. That basically says compassionate action trumps any religious label or ritual.
It absolutely does. Redefines true worship as ethical conduct and universal service. Connects right back to its view of God as this omnipresent, benevolent force working through natural law and love. Living in harmony with that, expressing it through kindness, that's devotion. Very practical, ethical, inclusive.
So we've gone through this deep dive into this late 19th century text, this whole challenging perspective. Why does exploring this historical viewpoint matter to us today? Especially, on a show like ours, focused on these themes.
Well, first, as the source intended, it aims to remove fear, offering consolation. Presenting death as a natural transition, not a terrifying end or potential hell where loved ones persist nearby. That offers a fundamentally less fearful, more comforting way to think about mortality. That emotional relief was, and probably still is, a huge appeal.
And it really seems focused on empowering the individual seeker.
Absolutely. It constantly stresses personal investigation, demonstration. What has been seen, heard, realized by the soul consciousness outweighs guesswork. It puts your own soul consciousness, your intuition, reason, spiritual perception as the ultimate standard for truth.
So it encourages you, the listener, to seek understanding yourself through experience, investigation, your own inner knowing, not just blind faith or authority.
Exactly. It gives you permission, maybe even the responsibility, to question and seek truth for yourself. And finally, as we've seen, this text lays out a complete alternative framework for understanding the universe, life, death, purpose, a system trying to integrate spiritual reality with natural law, evolution, progress, a benevolent divine.
By challenging those old boundaries between science, religion, the afterlife, it just presents a fundamentally different way of seeing things.
It does, and engaging with a detailed historical system like this, it reminds us there isn't just one way to make sense of the big questions. It shows a fully formed system from another time tackling the same issues with its own logic and confidence. And seeing that, well, it can't help but challenge our assumptions today, prompt us to think differently.
Right. It encourages us to keep investigating, maybe not this specific text, although it's fascinating, but just the act of questioning assumptions, exploring different views, seeking knowledge about reality within us and out there. A reminder that this deep human quest for understanding is ongoing. Well, this has been a truly fascinating deep dive, exploring this historical perspective on spiritualism, so detailed, so logical in its own way, and really bold and challenging the thinking of its time. We've unpacked its core ideas. The spirit as the real person, death as an exodus, the spiritual world being near and progressive, life as unending growth based on effort.
And we looked at its sharp critique of traditional theology, God's nature, hell, miracles, biblical infallibility, using historical and textual arguments, plus its embrace of evolution and natural law as part of the divine plan.
Right. And how it framed mediumship as natural law communication, acknowledged its complexities like fraud, and positioned spiritualism as demonstrating universal truths, advocating devotion through service, not just labels.
It's this comprehensive system aiming to swap fear for comfort, dogma for demonstrable truth and individual understanding, and a limited view of God and afterlife with this expansive vision of universal progress.
And all this brings us to a final thought. Building directly on the source's powerful ideas, that everything is constantly progressing under divine law, and that the spiritual world full of conscious, loving, remembering people is right here, interwoven with ours, just beyond our physical senses.
So, if that is the case, If consciousness, memory, affection continue and evolve in a realm so close, what might we, right now in our daily lives, be missing in the world around us? And maybe even more profoundly within ourselves.
What are we missing by maybe limiting our focus, our perception, just to the material, the easily seen, the physically sensed?
It leaves you wondering, doesn't it, about the potential for so much more experience, understanding, connection, if only we could develop the awareness, the conditions, the consciousness to perceive it?
Definitely something significant to ponder. Until our next deep dive.